Thanks for tuning in to the Teen Sports Podcast Network, where teens throughout the U.S. and their show guests tackle today's sports topics and issues from a teen perspective. And now, here's your host of the Teen Sports Podcast Network Illinois, Andrew Kish.
Thank you for tuning in to the Teen Sports Podcast Network Illinois. I'm your host, Andrew Kish. In today's episode, my guest is Jack Michaels, voice of the NHL's Edmonton Oilers. Thanks for taking the time to be my guest today, Jack.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's an honor to have you on my show today, Jack, really. It's going to be a great time. However, before we get started, I'm going to give our viewers and listeners today a quick rundown of today's game plan. In the first half, we're going to be talking about Mr. Jack Michaels' backstory within the sports media world. And in the second half, we're going to be talking about today's topic and issue, COVID-19 in sports. How has COVID-19 affected sports, and will sports be forever changed? A bit more on that later, though. Like I've said, it's awesome to have you on my show today, Jack. I know you've had an outstandingly successful career so far. So without further ado, let's go ahead and just get into this. My first question for you is always my favorite question to ask. And that question is, how did your passion for sports first come about? When did your love for sports first initially develop?
Well, I suppose it's, how my dad taught me to read. I mean, my dad taught me to read using the sports pages, back in the days when newspapers were, prevalent and probably the number one source of information for people. And you didn't have all these all sports radio stations. And this would have, been right around when ESPN was invented, but not necessarily, in our household. So, I think his hope, he was an English professor, and I think his hope ultimately was that I would move on to a more, scholarly approach and maybe, become, a professor or an educator of some sort. He taught at the university level for 40 plus years. But, as he said, I never really moved on from sports, and that was always my, primary source of interest. But yeah, that was a big way of, how he taught me to read is reading the sports pages, reading the box scores, reading the little summaries and the recaps of the various games and the various sports.
That's super interesting. I feel like a lot of people could find that super relatable because, so many people around the world absolutely adore and love sports. Obviously, yours has brought you to a full-on career. On that note, so many people that love sports, have a great passion for it. I mean, me, I have friends who just all they do is talk about sports. Me and them are a little different, though. I'm trying to pursue a career in broadcasting, and they're just obsessed with it in their own way. How did you come to the realization that you wanted to take your love for sports to the next level, make it your career, make it your livelihood?
Well, like most broadcasters, I played sports when I was younger, and like most broadcasters, there came a time when I realized I didn't have the talent to pursue it as a professional, as an athlete. And so, my next goal was how can I pursue, a career in sports if I'm not an athlete? And obviously covering sports, broadcasting sports, writing about sports, all of that kind of came into my mind. And really, when I was in college, I went to a broadcasting school, upstate New York, Ithaca College. Not really a broadcasting school. It obviously has a wide variety of fields, but it is a bit of a school that has a reputation nationwide as a way to get on the air relatively early and pursue a career in broadcasting. And actually, I did local sports for the college television station, and the guy who did local news, who was a classmate of mine and who was in all my classes for 4 years, was David Muir, who's now the lead anchor on the news for ABC.
Okay, yeah. So obviously from a young age then you knew, this is something I want to do. It's similar to me too. That's exactly, I guess you're right. All broadcasters kind of have that moment because I played basketball growing up from a very young age. It was the only sport that ever really clicked with me. And, as many, young.
You soon figured out you weren't going to be an all NBA all-star. So
yeah, absolutely. And, we stay attached to it. And the people who are the most successful, I feel like, are the people who realize that and they're like, okay, I still want to be part of this and I'm going to pursue that. So obviously, like you had just said, you started amateur play-by-play and things like that. What was the transition from going to just doing play-by-play to a regular sports team to the professional field? Like, how was that transition? What was that experience like?
Well, I mean, when I got out of college, I like a lot of people, I thought I'd have instant success and just, go straight from college classes to ESPN, and it didn't work out that way. And I ended up crawling back to my local radio station and taking a job as a kind of a news talk morning show guy that could do sports at night. And so I did small college football, basketball, and baseball, some high school football and basketball, some high school hockey. And ultimately, it was a hockey tape that I sent out that landed me my first, job with a team in minor pro hockey for a team in Colorado Springs. And that's kind of what led me down the path to not only working for a professional sports franchise, but, a hockey team in particular. And that's what took me, basically into hockey as opposed to, doing the other sports. I became basically a full-time hockey announcer. When I moved on to Anchorage, Alaska, I did some high school baseball and some American Legion baseball, but by and large, it was hockey from that point on, and that's the way it's been for the last 20 years. And the way it's turned out, I probably wouldn't wouldn't go back on that. It worked out very well. I did a high school game, state championship game in Pennsylvania, and the voice of the Penguins at the time encouraged me to submit the hockey tape and maybe, do, focus on hockey instead of college basketball or football. And it was lo and behold later that summer where I ended up getting my first offer.
That's incredible. So you got exactly what you went for. So then my question to follow up that is, so you said you ended up going with hockey just because that's how things went out. Is it growing up? Is that the sport you were super involved with? Because I know you said from a young age sports.
Not at all.
What was that sport?
I played tennis. I like every kid, I played street hockey, but I mean, in high school, I played tennis. I was most interested in watching the National Football League, and still am a huge fan today. I watch baseball. Hockey would have been, near the bottom of the barrel, to be honest with you, until Mario Lemieux came to the Penguins, and the Penguins became a contender very late in, my high school existence. And then all of a sudden they were the hot team. The Steelers were struggling. This was right before the Pirates got good. So it was one of those situations where, the Penguins were kind of the hot team in town, and I started to pay more and more attention to the sport. I mean, I had vaguely followed it, but I wasn't a huge fan other than to root against the teams that, Penguins fans hated, like the Flyers and the Bruins. And that's, interestingly enough, how I became kind of a secondary fan of the Edmonton Oilers, is because they played the Flyers and the Bruins 4 times in the Stanley Cup final when I was growing up, and I hated both of those teams, so I rooted for the Oilers.
That's awesome. It's a connection from way back in the day then. That's super cool to think about. So then one thing that I heard from a little birdie was that at some point you were the only American announcer for Canadian NHL teams. Is that still the case today?
Yeah, as far as I know, I'm the only person ever to do play-by-play for a Canadian team that's American born and raised.
Because every country has their sport. Majority of the world is soccer. America is football. Everybody knows how Americans are with their football. Yeah. So Canada, though, everybody knows how they care about their hockey. So what is it like being the only American announcer?
Well, it's not really so much the only American announcer anymore, so much as it's more, being privileged enough to work in a market where the Oilers are, the only game in town by all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
I mean, the Edmonton Eskimos play in the CFL, and they have a pretty rabid fan base, but nothing like the Oilers. I mean, the Oilers are the passion up here. The Oilers are probably Canada's, second favorite team. In other words, if you live in Toronto, you're a lot of people hate the Canadians, the Oilers. I guess there's some people in Calgary who probably, dislike the Oilers, but the Oilers are Canada's second favorite team. People in Toronto that can't stand the Canadians, people in Montreal that can't stand the Leafs. Ottawa has a relatively new fan base and doesn't have the same kind of following. And, and I think Vancouver's a bit of a on an island, so to speak. The Oilers are everyone's passion, certainly in Alberta, and I would suggest to you that most people in Canada would tell you that if their hometown club isn't in contention, that they prefer the Oilers over the other Canadian teams.
Really? Wow, that's a super interesting fact. I never would have thought that. It's got to be super cool to have a team with such a crazy fan base to be the voice of.
Well, it's the team that had the greatest team in the last 40 years, perhaps, in all the four major sports. I mean, you look at the Edmonton Oilers dynasty of the mid-1980s, unquestionably the greatest player in the history of the game, Wayne Gretzky, and then a whole host of other Hall of Famers, and Mark Messier and Grant Fuhrer and Yari Curry and Glenn Anderson. I mean, Paul Coffey. I mean, you're talking about one of the greatest teams ever assembled in any of the four major professional sports, a team that won 5 Stanley Cups in 7 years. I mean, you start rattling off the teams that have been able to win 5 cups in 7 years, five championships in 7 years. Green Bay comes to mind in the NFL. Then you have the Yankees in baseball. You have the Canadians in hockey. And in the NBA, you've got the Boston Celtics. So you're talking about the Oilers are one of a handful of teams across the four major professional sports with that kind of domination over that sort of sustained period of time. And that's where the love for the Oilers, I think, will remain undying, is because so many people grew up with those 1980s teams. And it was, again, one of the greatest teams of all time in any sport.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Because I mean, I am a Chicago Bulls fan. I'm in Illinois, so we had our little run with Michael Jordan.
There you go.
So I get completely what you're saying. Yeah.
The Bulls 6-8, so they actually, you know what? Yeah. They belong on that list too, 100%.
See, but it's the thing is, based on what you're saying, I mean, that's kind of even up there in impressiveness with what Michael Jordan did back in the '90s. So that's you got a fan base that's loyal like that. Because I know that for a fact. I mean, this year is the first time the Bulls have been good in like a decade, but I've been long strong because the legacy they have and the hometown culture.
The Bulls are on that list. I mean, we're talking about. Again, if you're going to list the top 10 teams of all time in any sport, the Bulls and the Oilers are going to be on it.
Absolutely.
So that's something that I think, Edmonton and the greater metro population still take a tremendous deal of pride in because, unlike the Bulls and unlike the Yankees and unlike the other teams I mentioned, the Oilers were born out of, expansion. I mean, they were, as a team, they weren't even constructed until 1972. And in the NHL, their first year in the league wasn't completed until 1980. 10 years later, they had 5 championships. I mean, that is unprecedented.
Yeah, that's not normal in sports at all.
Well, no, it's not only not normal, it's never happened. It's never happened. You've never had a team come into a league and 10 years later have 5 championships to show for it. Never. So, I think that's something that the Oilers can, think about it. The Packers, the Yankees, they've been around for a while. The Bulls, they've been around for a while. There's Norm Lear and some of those teams in the 70s. I mean, they've been around for a while. They hadn't had much success. But in terms of entering a league and having 5 championships to show for it after you've been in the league barely a decade, that's the Oilers and no one else.
Yeah, they definitely came in and gave themselves a name right off the bat. That's awesome.
Exactly.
That's super cool. So, okay. So obviously you've been in this field for a while now. You've had at least 11 years experience up to this point with the Oilers alone. So I couldn't imagine the amount of stories you could tell. But if you could think of one of your favorite or your funniest stories throughout the career you've had so far, what would that be?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question. I mean, I could go back to, one of my first years in Colorado in the minors where a Zamboni broke down at center ice before the game.
Oh, goodness.
Had to be postponed. That was at the old Arizona Veterans Memorial Coliseum. I could tell you about the volcano that erupted in Anchorage, which canceled our flight and led us to stay an extra week on the road, which turned into a 28-day road trip because we weren't able to get home in between some road games. I mean, I could go on and on. I've seen sand thrown on the ice in Anchorage. I've seen a coach throw his crutches on the ice in Anchorage, Alaska. I've seen a fellow broadcaster hurl a Pepsi onto the ice from the broadcast booth and in protestation of the officiating. I mean,
oh my goodness,
there's stories that I could give you that we don't have enough time on this.
Absolutely,
this podcast. But at the NHL level, I think you always remember your first game. Jordan Eberle scored in his NHL debut, and it turned out to be one of the goals of the year that year.
Nice.
Connor McDavid this year alone has scored 2 spectacular goals that'll probably finish as the number 1 and 2, best goals of the year. I mean, I could give you the, game 6 of the second round of the playoffs in 2017, where I didn't say anything for the last 30 seconds. That's how loud the crowd was. There was no point. So I've got a lot of memorable moments. I mean, I did a triple overtime game in Anchorage that decided a playoff series where, they had run out of water, and it was past midnight in Anchorage, Alaska before that game was finished. And that was a game that ended the series. So, I mean, there's so many aspects of my career that produce great stories, and I'm just privileged to be kind of along for the ride. When you come up through the minors, I think some of the best stories are come in the minor leagues, because you run into some situations that you can't possibly fathom. I mean, I've driven through 2 snowstorms in California. No one knows about the grapevine. And that's been the worst conditions I've ever driven in. And I can say it was driving to San Diego. Well, not many people think of a drive to San Diego as producing that kind of weather, but trust me, I've done it. I've driven through it. So It's all these situations that, make a career, somewhat interesting to, recall and talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a bunch of crazy experiences right there. And, one thing that I've always kept in mind, wanting to pursue in the broadcasting field is you got to be ready for any situation. And,
you got to be ready to move.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next opportunity might take you out of your comfort zone, and you've got to be ready to seize that opportunity and, hop on a plane and uproot your life and to take that next step in your career. And it's not for everyone. I'm not suggesting for a moment that everyone should do it. But if you choose this career, you have to consider that as a very real possibility, that you may not be settled for a long, long time.
Yeah, that's understandable. I mean, that's kind of in the sports world in its entirety. I know every professional sports player has to deal with that. And it's not just the players, it's the announcers, it's the staff, it's the people behind it, which is super interesting to think about. So then I got another question for you then here. So as I just mentioned, I'm trying to pursue a career in the sports broadcasting world. As someone who's had tons and tons of experience, what is a crucial tip that you think would help someone like me or anybody else trying to pursue a career in the sports broadcasting field? What do you think is an important tip for us to always keep in mind?
Well, I think number one, the foundation should be, a bit of a background in journalism and writing. I think, being able to communicate your thoughts and writing helps you, in a broadcasting standpoint. Being able to, think on your feet, writing words down, ultimately, I think helps in the translation in a verbal sense. In order to speak eloquently, I think you've got to be able to write eloquently. So I would stress to everyone to learn how to write and to take your writing courses seriously, because whether you realize it or not, it'll translate into the broadcast booth very easily. And then, in terms of actually, broadcasting, is I would encourage you to do, as much in the way of sportscasts and broadcasting a wide variety of sports anytime you've got an opportunity for experience to take it, because your improvement over the first 100 or 200 times that you speak publicly and that you broadcast, you'll never improve more than in those first 100 or 200 or 300 or 400 reps. And
Absolutely.
that's the key in this business is reps and finding a way to stay on the air and maintain an audience, whether it be through, sportscasts or, reading for your local news or doing whatever you can to get on the air. All of those experiences, I think, the more you do it, the better you get, especially early on.
Those are all tips that I'll definitely keep in mind. You really got me on the edge of my seat, honestly. You're living the dream. You're doing exactly what I hope to do one day in the broadcasting field. I got one more question for you, though, but it's actually not from me. Not too long ago, we asked our viewers and listeners of TSPN to submit some questions through Twitter, and we went ahead and selected one of those questions to ask for you today, and that comes from @BigBen2324, and he wants to know what the most pivotal moment has been during your media career, and he also wants to know what your favorite player of all time is.
My favorite player, and I'm going to take that at its base, which is player in any sport.
Okay.
Probably my favorite player of all time was Clyde the Glide. I loved Clyde. I loved him. My dog is named Clyde, actually.
Nice.
Yeah, and a very close second would probably be Roger Federer in tennis. So those are my favorite players. In terms of a pivotal moment, I'd have to say I've made a few decisions. Not getting involved in minor league baseball. In believe it or not, wrestling. I had an interview at WWE. There was a time where I actually was interviewed for a job down in Tampa for Greyhound racing. I would say not taking those three positions in particular were ultimately pivotal moments that allowed me to continue down a path in traditional sports and in professional hockey that I look back on now. You've probably heard the tired old cliche, sometimes the best moves you make are the ones you don't, and I would say that certainly holds true for me.
Hey, well, there you go, Big Ben. There's your answer. Moving forward, the Teen Sports Podcast Network will now feature a question from one of our viewers or listeners from Twitter in every single episode of the Teen Sports Podcast Network. So if you want your question to be asked on our show to one of our guests, make sure to have an active Twitter account and to follow us at TSPN Podcast for a chance for your question to be featured. Now, it's been a blast asking you all these questions and getting to know you a bit more, Jack. Unfortunately, though, we are going to have to move forward from this segment as we are reaching about the halfway mark of this episode. So in the next half, we're going to be talking about our topic and issue of the day, COVID-19 in sports. How has COVID-19 affected sports, and will sports be forever changed? We're going to be talking about this and more right after this short message.
You're in high school, serious about your future, and have a real desire to be near the action. Hi, Andrew Monaco, voice of the Texas A&M Aggies here. If you have an interest in a sports broadcasting career, the YSN Masterclass for high school students is your ticket. An online, on-demand series of video lessons conducted by sports industry professionals ready to help fast-track your sports broadcasting career. Learn more and register today at ysnacademy.com, ysnacademy.com.
And welcome back to the Teen Sports Podcast Network, Illinois. I'm your host, Andrew Kish, currently here with the voice of the Edmonton Oilers, Jack Michaels. We just got finished learning a whole bunch of fascinating information about Jack Michaels and his journey throughout the sports media world. But now we're going to be getting into today's topic and issue of COVID-19 in sports. How has COVID-19 affected sports, and will sports be forever changed? So to get this discussion started, there's a few key points I want to mention. Every sport seems to be handling this in its own unique way. I mean, coming from the NBA and the NHL bubble in 2020 to in 2022, still having downright cancellations. Let's just start with something I know you're familiar with, Jack, which is the Edmonton Oilers. I know the Oilers are limited to half capacity still in 2022 with fans with a proof of vaccination or a negative COVID test. Alongside not having the normal fans they do, even in 2022, they have to sit so many players for the COVID protocols. I know early this January, they had to sit star forward Connor McDavid alongside Derek Ryan. And then even later in the month, they had to sit your goaltender, Stuart Skinner. So clearly this is affecting your team a lot. What are your thoughts on this, Jack?
Well, the player list is, I think, up to 20, and a couple of coaches, including the head coach and an assistant coach. So, it's part of our world now, unfortunately, and in fact, we just announced the rescheduling of those 9 postponed games you mentioned, and 8 are going to be during the scheduled Olympic break, which of course is not going to happen now for National Hockey League players. So I know we're disappointed about that, and it's just an unfortunate reality. I mean, there's not much you can do except, as we were talking about in the first segment, is adjust to the different circumstances that the world and life bring you. It's nothing I anticipated when I got into this business, but I'm sure it's nothing any of us anticipated through much of the year 2019, which isn't that long ago, believe it or not. Now it seems like a reality where you try to imagine what life was like before the world is the way it is now. But there's no turning back. There's only moving forward, and I think it's going to be a schedule that is extremely compressed for the Edmonton Oilers. If you'll recall, the last National Hockey League lockout was the 2013 campaign, and the Oilers played 48 games in 98 days. Tomorrow, January 20th, will begin a stretch where the Edmonton Oilers play their final 47 games in 100 days. So almost identical, and a highly compressed schedule that'll certainly put the club to the test.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing to see how much of a factor COVID is still playing here in 2022. I mean, my Blackhawks have even been affected with Hagel, Lafferty, and others being taken out early January, and my team even have to pull up people from the Ice Hogs to fill roster spots.
Everyone has, in every sport. I mean, there's teams that miss the National Football League playoffs because COVID hit them at the wrong time. And they had to field teams, one without a starting quarterback, and one with kind of a shell of a club. It's just it's the way it is. I mean, New Orleans played a nationally televised game without any of its top 3 quarterbacks. So I mean, it's just one of those scenarios where it's unfortunate. I think it's skewed some of the results. Certainly, New Orleans comes to mind as one of the teams that probably missed out on a postseason spot due to the effects of COVID-19. But there's really no point in, wringing your hands about it. I mean, it's just a reality that every team in professional sports is going to have to, handle and basically survive as best they can. And that means financially, competitively, up and down the organization. I think a lot of teams have fought hard to keep everyone employed and moving forward through a difficult time. And that's not limited to professional sports. That's in all occupations.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to see just some of the repercussions of the whole thing. I mean, I never thought I'd see the Blackhawks having to pull up players from the Ice Hogs to fill roster spots. It's absolutely crazy. Staying on the topic of the NHL, I know the NHL and the Players Union have both agreed to not participate in the 2022 Beijing Olympics. And this makes it 2 Winter Olympics in a row that the NHL will not be participating. Considering they're only first allowed to do so in 1998, this has got to be heartbreaking for hockey fans around the world.
Well, the players too. I mean, I talked about that earlier. I think the players are among those most disappointed, and the Olympics won't be the same, without the National Hockey League players. I'm sure the Summer Olympics would tell you that they miss when the NBA isn't there. So
yeah,
it's unfortunate, but there's no way around it. I mean, it just didn't work out this year. It was a hopeful process, but with this latest spike, it became inevitable that the NHL would be unable to go. So now you just look forward to hopefully 2026 or perhaps a World Cup before that, because I think the players really enjoy those best on best tournaments.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, COVID is not just affected just hockey, though. Like you said, it's all sports. I mean, it's really crazy to see how COVID's been affecting not only the last Olympics, but this Olympics. I mean, the Beijing 22 committee has announced that no more tickets would be sold to the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games, which is crazy to think about because there's going to be so many people not able to watch the games live. I mean, we already knew that back in September when they announced nobody No foreigners will be allowed to come. So it's just crazy. It's almost like there's no end in sight.
Yeah, and again, like I said, there's, I don't necessarily see the end. I just hope that at some point, whether it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, at some point we'll be able to, navigate our way through this and get to a point where, some semblance of normalcy returns. Although I think there is a new normal that is yet to be established yet.
Yeah, it's just mind-blowing to see how much COVID-19 has stomped on worldwide sports. I mean, COVID-19 is the biggest disruption to worldwide sports since World War II. And a lot of people, I think, have the mindset that once this is gone, it's over. But once the virus is gone, I think sports will never be the same. Whether that's for good or bad, that's still for the world to decide, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd agree with that statement.
It's sad to see what's all has happened, honestly. I really look forward to see how sports will grow and adapt from this. And I also really look forward to see what our viewers and listeners will have to say now that we've discussed all of this, Jack.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I mean, I think there's one thing I want to comment with respect to broadcasting and those who are considering a future in the business. And I think this goes for all occupations really, but there's a failure to prepare and a failure to prepare is preparing to fail. That's kind of an old cliche. And I tell you, when you get ready for a broadcast and really anything that you want to do well in life, and I know that I find myself doing this when I get ready for each game over the course of an 82 game schedule. At times, it can feel like the dog days when the bloom of a new season is off and the prospect of playoffs is still very much, in the distant future. I would say this: when you're getting ready for a game as a broadcaster, or for that matter, or a journalist, or anything that's worthwhile doing at the very best you can do in life, is when you do research for a game and you jot down notes, you might find yourself going over some excruciating minutia that you feel, how can it possibly work itself into a broadcast? And what I would say is this: it's better to have that information and not need it than need it and not have it. And I would just, caution everyone that when you get ready for a game, make sure you've covered every possible eventuality. And that's what I try to do before every game. I try to envision a number of scenarios that could work themselves out, and I want to be ready for each one. And, inevitably there's going to be, an odd occurrence that you can't possibly have covered. But I always like to feel like I enter every broadcast as prepared as I can be. So that's one
Absolutely.
thing I just wanted to kind of remind everyone to get into this business. It's just like anything else. You do not want to feel naked in the middle of a show.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like that advice could be used in a lot of circumstances, not just in the broadcasting world. So
Absolutely.
That's something super important to keep in mind.
Yeah, a job interview for that matter, right? Anything you want to do in life. Think about what you do to get ready for an extended road trip with your buddies. I mean, the car is filled. You got some snacks. You got your money. You got your wallet. You got your cell phone. Think of that when you're preparing for a broadcast. You want to have all the tools in your toolbox. There's a 90% chance you're going to use 10% of what you've prepared. But again, it's better to have all that info and not end up using it than have an area where you could have used something and not have it because you didn't do the work to get ready for it.
Yeah. Well, Jack, I just want to thank you one more time. But before I let you go, is there any way our viewers and listeners can follow you online?
Well, I'm at Edmonton Jack, at Edmonton Jack on Twitter, at Edmonton Jack on Instagram. And feel free to, I think my DMs are open. So if you ever have a question or want to send me a direct message, there's an opportunity to do that through those social media channels. So it's at Edmonton Jack, both Instagram and Twitter.
Sounds great. Everyone who's watching or listening today, make sure to go follow Mr. Jack Michaels. Thanks again, man. That's all though. That's our show for today. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Teen Sports Podcast Network Illinois. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, all at TSPN Podcast. I'm your host of the Teen Sports Podcast Network Illinois, Andrew Kish. Thanks for tuning in.